Today, we're going to talk about the potential for voter fraud. And what I'm going to do is, rather than give you my opinion, I am going to give you the facts and let you decide. The Doctor of Disaster is a wholly owned subsidiary of Warnick and Associates Incorporated. Don't forget to get your copy of the Doctor of Disaster's book, Emergency Incident Management Systems, at Amazon.com. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Doctor of Disaster. I am the Doctor of Disaster, Dr. Mark Warnick. I am considered a subject matter expert in public safety and public health by not one, but two different universities. Without any further ado, I'd like to remind you to like, subscribe, and comment. This helps me with the YouTube algorithm, and quite frankly, this information needs to get out. Today, we're going to talk about the potential for voter fraud. And what I'm going to do is, rather than give you my opinion, I am going to give you the facts and let you decide. Voter fraud is important to public safety, especially in the 2020 election. When we discuss some of the issues that it affects, we can easily see that voter fraud could affect public safety if the fraud is from the side that wants to get rid of law enforcement, or at least reduce their numbers. By the same token, if we look at the other side, they may want to increase law enforcement presence or their numbers. So we've got to look at this from both sides, and you need to make your own opinion. So let's start with a historical review of voting. Voting actually started before we became a country. And in the early years of the United States becoming a country, it was very different than it is now. The vast majority of those that were allowed to vote were males, 21 or older, who owned property. Now, back in those days, property was cheap, so it was possible. States such as New Jersey early on allowed women and people of color to vote. In some states, people of color that were over 21 and that owned property were allowed to vote. So, back in those days, one of the things that was very much different was it was a celebratory time. On voting days, they had drinking festivals and a party atmosphere, impromptu parades, and so much more. In many votes, there were, for lack of a better word, intimidation and trying to buy votes. In fact, if you look at history, it was not uncommon to literally rent out a tavern and pay the bill in order to garner votes for you. So, while we had a sordid history with voting, that's actually the way it started. Now, as they went through time, they started putting in various stopgaps. One of those was intimidation at the polls. Back in the 1700s, they used to allow people to use tactics to intimidate people to vote for their candidate, which quite frankly wasn't right. So while America was in this phase, it was not out of the ordinary because of the time and who they were. But as time went on, there was more and more restrictions put on regarding how you can treat people and what you can and can't do. So that's a basic history of voting. Now we come to 2015, 2016, 2019, 2020, and we look at what is proposed, what was done, and if you listen to the left, integrity is there in voting. If you listen to the right, there's voter fraud. So how do we make up our mind about whether mail-in ballots should be allowed or not? One of the things that I want to bring up is the recent Supreme Court case. There was a recent Supreme Court case that asked for the states to be able to clean up the voter rolls. What happened was there were more people in some counties in the United States that had more voters than they had population. Now, while this is not indicative of someone purposely defrauding the voting system, it did give opportunity. So what was found out was that 24 million voter registrations nationwide, 1 out of every 8 people are inaccurate, outdated, and some 2.8 million voters are registered in 2 or more states. Now, I'm sorry, but that's a substantial number. Would it sway an election? That depends on how close it would be. So the National Voter Registration Act, it gives the requirements that states must meet to remove a voter that's no longer eligible because of a change of residence. Now, how did this come about? Well, there was a survey done in 21 states by the Government Accountability Institute, which showed that almost 8,500 individuals voted illegally in more than one state during the 2016 presidential election. Yes, you heard me correctly. That was 8,500 individuals during the 2016 presidential election. So it became clear to the Supreme Court when they got the case that they needed to give the go-ahead to clean up the voter rolls. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. We look at other voter fraud and we see that the U.S. Justice Department charged a former Democratic Congressman, Michael Myers, with stuffing ballot boxes, bribing an elected official, falsifying records, obstructing justice, and voting multiple times in federal elections in Philadelphia. Now, Dominic DeMuro, a Democratic ward chairman in Philadelphia, admitted to stuffing the ballot box by literally standing in a voting booth and voting over and over again as fast as he could, while he thought that the coast was clear. DeMuro allegedly had a network of clients who paid him significant sums of money to rig elections. Additionally, in New Jersey, 4 New Jersey residents, including 1 city council member and 1 city councilman-elect in Paterson, New Jersey, were charged in what state officials said was a mail-in ballot fraud scheme. 4 people from New Jersey were charged with multiple crimes, including voting fraud, tampering with public records, and unauthorized possession of multiple vote-by-mail ballots. So in other words, they had these ballots that they weren't legally allowed to have, and they voted with them. In Pendleton County, West Virginia, there were several absentee mail-in ballot requests in which the party's ballot request was changed from Democrat to Republican. What this mail carrier did was he saw 4 or 5, I can't remember how many he actually did, but he asked for a mail-in ballot form and changed what party they were voting for, and he intended to vote that way. And if I'm not mistaken, this was for Republican. Then in California, there was a Skid Row scheme. A 62-year-old Norman Hall pled guilty in a scheme to pay money and cigarettes to homeless people on Los Angeles Skid Row in exchange for false and forged signatures on ballot petitions and voter registration forms. In the state I live in Illinois, it was disclosed that a programming error, of course it's a programming error, in a signature pad at driver services facilities led to 574 non-U.S. citizens accidentally being registered to vote. At least 1 and perhaps as many as 15 non-citizens may have voted in the 2018 election, and then in 2019 a former mayor was convicted of absentee ballot fraud. In a mayoral race, he won by just 16 votes. Then you have the New Jersey real estate developer, who was a Democrat, who got convicted of paying low-income residents in Hoboken, New Jersey, subsidized their housing for $50 for their votes in the 2013 election. Then in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Supervisor Peggy West, 47, pled guilty in 2018 to election fraud for falsifying signatures on petitions to qualify for the spring election. In 2018, authorities arrested a Florida man after they determined he had stolen 5 absentee ballots and fraudulently voted with them. In New Mexico, 2018, authorities indicted a woman on 13 counts of voter fraud related to her husband's 2016 mayoral race. In 2016, an Indiana police officer was convicted of absentee ballot fraud in an attempt to help his father win city council election. In Arizona, there was double voting during the 2016 election. This man was caught. He voted in Arizona and Nevada. In the 2016 presidential election, police said they found evidence of voter fraud in Indiana. The Indiana State Police were investigating a Democratic-affiliated group hired by Patriot Majority USA, and they said in an analysis that they ran of the Indiana voter file, they found 837,000 voters with out-of-date addresses, 4,556 double registrations, 3,000 records without birth dates, and 31 registered voters that were too young to vote. And they were investigating that. Additionally, the FBI launched an investigation in September of 2016 into 19 dead Virginians who had been re-registered to vote in Harrisonburg, VA. Now, this came about because a clerk, an alert clerk, noticed that someone that was recently deceased re-registered to vote. And this was done by a group called Harrisonburg Vote. There was also cases of voter fraud proven in the 2016 election in quite a few states, including Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. In Missouri, incumbent Penny Hubbard won the Democratic primary, but she won it because of a wave of absentee ballots. A judge later ruled that more than 200 absentee votes were improperly counted because they were not sealed in envelopes. So while we talk about all this, we can see that there is actually voter fraud, some of it with mail-in voting. The Heritage Foundation did a review of multiple voter frauds, and I believe it was from 2010 or 2000. I'm not quite sure on that, but they found over 6,000 cases. There is no voter fraud registration where people are put in a database, but it's fairly easy to see that mail-in voter fraud is possible. As far as the veracity of this fraud, we really don't know how much we are missing. So if we've caught 1% of it, how many haven't we caught? And this is a question we really need to look at, simply because you won't catch every crime. It's impossible. If we could catch every murderer, then how come there's so many cold cases that have gone on for 25 years? So we need to look at how much fraud there actually is. And nobody really knows because we don't have a centralized database. Now, in some states, there is a great potential for more voter fraud, especially mail-in voter fraud. Watch this video, and I don't know what state this lady's in or whatever, but you can see that in some states it's very possible that someone looking at someone else's mail could determine whether they agreed with them or not and snag their mail. Watch this.
So, I just wanted to warn all the people that want to vote by mail. You know how they give you these sleeves inside, and they tell you, oh, don't worry, your vote is going to be, protected. Nobody's going to know anything, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? That's bull. Now, there are people that probably know this, but I just found this out today. So I'm thinking, okay, I put my vote in, I did the protective sleeve and all that, and that's what the back looks like. But then when you turn it around, and I just want to, show you the comparison, look at my brother's, who's a Democrat. It says 4212D, that's Democrat. Then you go here, because we're both the same address anyway, 4212R. Okay, so your vote is supposed to be protected. Nobody's supposed to know what you're voting for, but yet they put R right here and D right there. So a postal person could see this if they're a Democrat and say, oh, that's an R. Let's toss it. Let's just chuck it, and we'll keep this one.
We can see that it is truly possible to commit fraud with the mail. There's no doubt about that. But how secure is our voting based on that? How bad will the fraud be? Or have we just seen a little bit and that's all we're going to see? In this video, I wanted to give you the options. I wanted to give you the information. I wanted you to see the potential of what's happening. Now, one thing that I do want to mention is, will mail-in voting disenfranchise voters? They no longer go in and get the little I voted sticker or any of that. Will that lead to lower or higher voting? We don't know. I also want to mention what happened in 2012 in Oregon. A temporary worker was counting votes with other election staff when she tampered with 2 ballots, filling in blank spaces to cast additional votes. So they mailed the ballot in. They didn't check a couple of boxes, so she took the opportunity to do that. This really brings about the question, are those votes secure? Now, let's talk about what happens when these votes are turned in. The U.S. mail has said that they can't handle the volume and guarantee that the votes will be in on time. And this draws concern. Now, most people would think, well, if they don't have the ballots in, they just won't be counted. Well, that's problematic in itself, because what happens if your candidate didn't get their votes? Secondly, what happens if there is a delay that essentially stops the election from being certified? Another thing to consider, the Loyola University Chicago Law Journal put out a paper in volume 51, issue 2, winter of 2019, article 3, preparing for a disputed presidential election, an exercise in election risk management. It was written by Edward B. Foley, and I really encourage you to read this and to read it thoroughly. But a basic synopsis of this is, if the election cannot be certified or certified within a specified time, I believe it's the 18th of January 2021, then the President of the Senate will try to get the vote certified. If he can't, then the Speaker of the House will become temporary president while there is another vote or the election is settled somehow. It may even go to a Supreme Court. So with these votes being potentially held up in the mail, are we going to have a president, or are we going to have the Speaker of the House? Now, in all fairness, some of you are saying Nancy Pelosi is acting president. However, because the congressional election is at the same time, we don't know if Nancy Pelosi at that time will be Speaker of the House. Perhaps they haven't certified the presidential election, but the congressional election is settled. And what that would do is, if the Republicans were to take back the House, then it could potentially be a Republican. However, if the Democrats held the House, they could potentially have Nancy Pelosi or anyone else for that matter. So for this reason, it is even more important that voting is done in person. Now, after going through all this, and you can see the evidence on both sides, quite frankly, the evidence points to low voter fraud, but what happens when it is a case where there's only a few thousand votes difference? And this is what we need to consider. So I've given you all the evidence, and I'm going to ask you to decide whether you believe there's voter fraud, sufficient amount of voter fraud, and then I'm going to ask you whether you think that mail-in voting is allowable, or is it something we shouldn't do at all? Oregon's been doing it for years. What about your state? Should they do it? Shouldn't they do it? It's your decision. So I'm going to end it with that, and I'm going to let you decide. Now, if you have someone that is on the fence about voter fraud or mail-in ballots, please feel free to share this video. I am Dr. Mark Warnick. I have a PhD in public safety, and this is the reason that I took this on. And it is to help you to decide where you stand on the issue. Unfortunately, we have many in politics today that don't have an agenda. They just want to beat. They want the power. So let's try and make sure that our agenda, whether you're left or right, is what you vote for, and that someone does not steal your vote or offset your vote. You have to make up your own mind where that is. Make sure to share, make sure to like, subscribe, and go ahead, hit the notification bell so you get a notice when I come out with something. Until next time, see you later and be safe. The Doctor of Disaster is a wholly owned subsidiary of Warnick & Associates Incorporated.